All right, cool. Welcome everyone. Well, I'm Angela. I think I've maybe spoken to most of you over email or otherwise. But a little bit of background. So I'm head of design at a health tech startup called Flexpa. Actually, I'm wearing the sweater today. And I've been in healthcare for maybe 4-ish years now. And the reason I started Design Rounds is I'm the only designer at Flexpa. So it's helpful. I find it really nice and helpful to just brainstorm ideas, have thought partners, share context. Healthcare is such a complex space, as you guys all probably know. So it's nice to have an opportunity to just bounce ideas around. So this was hopefully a forum to do that. I think the first session was maybe in March. So this will be number 4 or 5. And it continues to grow and change. So I'll send out a feedback form after the session as well. So whatever feedback you guys have to make this a good learning opportunity for everybody would be great feedback. So a couple house cleaning items. Let me just check my notes here. I am recording. Oh, one thing we like to do, it's a small group today, so maybe we have time for introductions. But regardless, if you go into, I always forget where this thing is, participants, you can hover over your name and update your display name. So what we like to do is just do our name and then with a dash or something at, like for me, it'd be Angela at Flexpa, design at Flexpa. So it's just helpful for everyone to kind of see at a glance where we're all at. That's for me. Everyone could do that as well. And then thank you all for having your cams on. I think it's helpful for us to just see each other while we're chatting, nicer than boxes with initials on it. So thank you for that. And what else? I think that is it. The last logistical thing, just to avoid people doing the start, stop, interrupting each other when we're going on and off mute, is to use the little raise hand function. So you can find that in your reactions. It's a very weird location to have it, I think, but if you go to reactions, you can do raise hand, and then Zoom automatically orders us in the order that we raised our hands. And then once you're in the top left of the screen, feel free to just chime in. No need to wait for me to call on you or anything like that. Okay. I think that's it. Oh, and when you do speak for the first time, feel free to give a quick introduction, where you work, what your role is, etc. And that's all. Okay. Let's jump into it. I'm probably going to start panting at like minute 45 from this walking, but I will maybe stop the treadmill if that gets to be the case. All right. One new thing I wanted to try this time was, for the rest of the design rounds, 15 minutes or so, if you think of any good books that you've read in healthcare, please feel free to throw them in the chat. I'd love to start compiling just like resources this group has come across. So any books that have changed how you perceive the work that you do, healthcare space in general, design, please throw them in the chat. Okay, so our agenda today has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 awesome topics, so I'm pretty excited to dive in. The first one comes from Chuck over there in a coffee shop. Feel free to jump in to paraphrase if this is exactly how you wanted to ask it, but Chuck's question is, how do you solve the inclusive/accessibility issue for the medical and healthcare industry? Since there are so many niche needs, should there be universal design for all users, or should there be more specificity? For example, seniors, disability, etc. So I'll pop this question into the chat. Oh, Jesse, sorry, I don't have a public agenda, so I kind of just run through it, but I'm happy to paste the questions in as we go. Chuck, feel free, if I didn't capture the nature of your question the way you'd wanted to, feel free to chime in to clarify, but I think the question is to what extent should we be solving for the 80-20 versus the needs of very specific niche user types. I guess starting off, just reflecting on this question and my time at Oscar. Obviously, there's like, if you're catering to a very specific population, that ends up being your 100%. I think when I worked at Oscar with patients across the United States being our population, that obviously ends up having so much variation. We found like feature by feature, I think, is where a lot more of the consideration came down to, rather than like the Oscar app as a whole. How would you make this fit for the 80, but like still not exclude your users in like more specific niches? But it came down to like, okay, for this particular feature, who is going to be the primary user for it? And then what are ways in which we could build in, accessibility for elderly users or visually impaired? So like, can you have a font size increase option somewhere? It doesn't have to be obvious, like it doesn't have to be default 24 pixels for everybody, but it's a setting that once guided to it, a user can configure. Yeah, I think maybe that would be the consideration I would have.
I wanted to ask a clarification question. Chuck, are you speaking specifically to accessibility standards that might go beyond ADA compliance and some of the more sort of like standard things that exist across UX design, standards that exist across UX design as they pertain specifically to healthcare? Or are you speaking more to elevating and going beyond those standards for specific use cases?
My question was quite, I think Angela kind of answered the question. My question was actually just for like, sometimes like depends on your hospital, like Angela said, depends on the situation. But I just wondered if it's like there's lots of people actually using the healthcare software or applications. We're just wondering like how do you like compromise like inclusive design for everyone, or do you I think that was my question. I think Angela actually did answer for it. It's like I sent this email like a month ago. So I don't actually remember why what was the intent at the time, but I think it's for the mix of when Angela said the feature by feature, and then users can customize themselves if they needed it. So I think that's pretty much like answered to my question. Yeah.
I had a quick question for the group. My name is Jessie, by the way. I am head of design at Candid Health, and I'm the only designer at the company. And so I also find it really valuable to chat to other designers in the field. And I think that one thing that is challenging for me on this topic of accessibility is knowing what tools to leverage or what tools to use as we build out our design system internally to ensure that the system as a whole is following certain accessibility guidelines. And as I imagine, we're all very, very busy, especially for our on small teams. And so I was wondering if anybody uses tools or would recommend certain tools that will help I guess identify parts of the system that are not accessible. One example is I've used a Figma colorblind tool before, but it wasn't it was pretty difficult to use, and so I'm wondering if people have other software hopefully like free software that is like helpful on this topic.
One of the engineers on our team introduced me to Lighthouse, which is a developer console tool. Have you heard of that one before, Jesse? So Lighthouse, I'm just looking at it on my other screen right now. Lighthouse, basically I have my app open. I open my developer tools with Lighthouse and I can basically just hit like analyze page load or analyze, and it analyzes based on performance, accessibility, whatever best practices means, SEO, and even like, I'm not sure what progressive web app is, but it helped us identify a bunch of like standards that we were missing or HTML tags that we should have had, obviously like color contrast. And this was a lot easier than doing it in Mox because it does it on your web application directly. So it's a Chrome developer tool called Lighthouse, which we found pretty awesome. And you can change between mobile device, desktop, evaluating it against either of those platforms.
Okay, I'm guessing it's that one. If you said it's a Chrome developer tool. Yeah, I'll definitely take a look at this. I'd love to investigate more.
Yeah, that's one. Does anyone else use a cool tool at work, either for mocks or in actual development? All right. Okay. Well, if we have any other additions to Chuck or Jesse's question, feel free to drop them in the chat. But we'll go on to the next one. Oh yeah, Elena said Flatiron team also borrowed standards from material design to build accessibility directly into the design system. All right, so this next question. Hey, JJ. Okay, this next question comes from Ali, who I don't believe could make it in the end, and Sophia, who is here. Was here. But the question is, what are some best practices, or how do we translate medical feedback into solutions for a product that already exists? A few design rounds ago, we talked about something similar, which is a lot of us have clinicians or clinical folks as our users, where we have to translate like medical processes, medical understanding into features or updates, pain points, opportunity areas of the application. So the question is, how have people done that, and what are some best practices you guys have seen? JJ, I really like your background.
Thanks. I'm going to ask a clarifying question here. What does it mean by for a product that already exists? You mean like a new feature for an existing product or platform?
That's what I would, unfortunately, both people who asked a question along these lines weren't able to make it, I guess. But that's how I understood it as well. Like the product is there, they're making updates to features or updates to processes based on medical feedback.
Got it. Well, I can share how we do it here at Unite Us. When we get feedback from our users, we have a feedback loop process, and we use that to we'll actually in some cases just reach out directly to the person who provided that feedback and kind of dig in and try to get them to explain what the gap is between our current feature set and what they're looking for. Like where are we missing bringing some value to their experience with us? We try to get away from them saying, well, I need something that does this, and more to focus on here's the pain I'm experiencing, and then kind of leave it to us to figure out how to address that pain. That's been a bit of a process. Some users get that better than others, to fall in love with the problem, to help us fall in love with the problem. A lot of them just say, hey, I want a button that does this thing right here, when it's not actually relevant to what the underlying issue is. And that's usually the biggest challenge, because they're not UX folks, right? They're just folks who are struggling to figure out how to address something in their experience, in their life and job, that they might not necessarily have the vocabulary to articulate. But once we do, it's awesome.
Neha, I see that you were at PharmD. Are you on the, apologies, I should know this, but are you on the clinician side or in a like tech role side?
I am a clinician. I do not work at a health tech company right now. It's something that I'm looking for, but I'm exploring different roles and trying to understand where I could fall into health tech, and design and user experience is something that really motivates me, because I've worked in healthcare IT in large operational organizational wide projects where the design of the EHR that we're rolling out is greatly going to impact how well our users use it. And so yeah, I'm not in tech right now, just exploring.
I'd be curious on this question, like how would you or will you think about this from the clinician perspective? Like there are these like processes that you follow in order to provide the best care for patients.
Mm-hmm.
And then to be asked about these processes and like how to update them, how to change them, like what might be the best way for us from the design side to approach asking these questions to clinicians?
So I think something that I've always done is you can ask the question, but like we mentioned, the clinician or the user may not have either the time or the know-how and the vocabulary to really articulate what it is they're looking for. But the third thing is also they may not actually know. You may not know why they're asking for what they're asking, right? And I think getting to the root of that problem is probably the most important thing, because what they may be asking you is just a surface level change to do basically a workaround. But instead, if you could just fix the actual problem, they wouldn't need the workaround. And it may be a design issue, it may be a functionality issue, but I think getting to the root of that, why are you asking for this change? And then sometimes even like what I usually do is shadow to see what it is that the exact workflow that they're going through, because you will probably see something that they won't see, or they won't even know is working incorrectly or working less than optimally.
That's a really good point. I love when we have like somewhat of a clinical background in design rounds, because I feel like we're like sharks attacking the clinician, like help. But one question we've had in the past, and I would also love your take on, and I think those on this call might benefit from as well, was there's this tension, I suppose, between launching a small feature little by little and trickling it in so that we don't disrupt a provider's like day-to-day work, versus those slow trickles might be more painful to get used to and to change your habits like constantly, versus a like entire versioning update. So like the whole thing changes overnight or something like that. Maybe not the whole thing, but a larger chunk of features changes overnight. How would like you approach this, especially from an EHR perspective, right? You're doing like patients over every single day, something small changes versus like something bigger changes.
So So what I've seen work, I've worked in dozens and dozens of hospitals across the country and internationally as well. What I've seen worked well is something that's essentially a newsletter that goes out to all clinical users. You have to be very careful with the with the frequency of it. I think every other week seems to work really well, but it's specific to just your EHR. Here's what's coming up, and here's what's happening in the immediate future. And then also a feedback form within that newsletter to say, is there anything that, you'd really like to see, just like major changes. But to answer your question about iterative versus large scale, I think if it's so for us, it's about clinical programs. So if you're making a major change to any kind of clinical guideline, clinical process or program, or starting a new program, or you're changing, a major workflow, that has to be all at once because it takes a lot of training. And you want to make sure people pass that training as well. So they're not blindsided about it. But I think for tweaks that just improve usability, it should be intuitive enough that they shouldn't have to read about it. They shouldn't have to, get an update about it. But I primarily work with Epic. There are ways that we can do that within the system to give them that little bit of an update, but we generally tend not to, because that's another alert that they're going to get. The systems the health systems that work well with their users are the ones that kind of give that feedback in those newsletter type formats, so that the change you're making should be intuitive anyway. So you shouldn't really need a disclaimer or I guess a description of why you're making this change. But if it's something that's a major rehaul, then yes, of course, you need to do a big bang rollout.
Yeah, Jill, please go ahead.
So I'm also not like in a full-time role right now in tech. I used to be a registered nurse, so I'm in a similar boat where, like I'm coming from a healthcare standpoint, and it's interesting to hear all about this because it's like the other end of it. But I think for us nurses, our workflow is very on the go. Like, like 1 second, like we're like in a patient's room, and then next you're getting pulled to like a phone call, So when it comes to like changes in the healthcare system or like the EHR, it's very overwhelming, especially for like the older nurses. So when it's like a big change, we usually have like super users who come and like train the staff. And it takes several days to do that. But I think that like specifically for like nurses and like the people who are like giving like bedside care, I think it's important to like not overwhelm them and like maybe like roll out like one feature at a time. Because it is a lot for those people. And it like takes away from like the time that they could be spending with the patient, especially because they're constantly needed by like patients, doctors, or like families, for example. So yeah, it's very interesting take because it's like a different part of healthcare. But yeah.
I have a follow-up question that maybe Jill kind of like alludes to a little bit of the dynamic that you were calling out. I don't work with like caregivers directly. The work that Candid Health does is the medical billing. So actually like facilitating between healthcare providers and like payers and patients. So everybody gets their claims paid. But I think one thing that is like an overlapping theme that I come up against a lot is how much to design the system with the assumptions of like super users, like you alluded to. So there are like super billers who just know everything about medical billing, like which codes to use and like what this denial means and like what the BCB, like Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas, is trying to do when they give you this sort of like remittance. And I think that there's like this inherent tension where some of our users are like on that side of the spectrum, or like maybe to draw the analogy to what you were saying, Jill, like they're kind of like the older nurses, like people who've been using the system for a really long time. And then there are like healthcare startups who have like never submitted any claims to insurance before and actually don't know anything about like CPT codes at all. And so I'm wondering, like, maybe everybody in this room has like a version of this tension, and I'm wondering how people sort of navigate how much to make the software like intuitive to the general human who doesn't know anything about the domain versus like very specifically tailored to that like super biller or, you know, like super nurse or whatever it is.
I think I think that like a lot of healthcare charting systems, I think personally, like I've used a lot of them, and there's not that many. I only know like one really good one, like Epic, which is what Neha was mentioning. And what makes it better than all the other ones is that it's like simple, intuitive, and I think something to keep in mind when designing for healthcare providers is that like it just needs to get them from like point A to point B, and it has to be very intuitive, because there's other like healthcare systems where it has like so many icons, there's so many things going on, and especially when you have so many things to do, it's like it gets really overwhelming. So I think one thing to keep in mind is just like, yeah, just keeping it simple. And then making things like clearly visible, like, you know, like the action buttons and all that. And then just having like a good flow to the design.
And to add to Jill's point, what we usually do, or what I've seen in some places, is that you'll design with the super user, but you'll also add a tip sheet, so that it can be disseminated across the board, so that there's no variability in what's being shared. And then that way, you know, again, your mileage may vary because, like Jill said, people are very busy. They don't necessarily have the time, but at least it's there for them to reference, and as opposed to having to ask someone.
I think to this question about super users versus or power users versus your general user, I think there is also a question of proportion there, right? So if you have one super user to every 10 general users, right, you probably want to design with the person who's going to be using it most often in mind. But I think also there's a way, and I think Apple does this really well, is that they will sort of sneakily design for both. If you want to go deeper, the tools are very easy to access, but if you don't, like if you want to use the command line in Apple, you can use the command line, but you can also just use the folder system, right? And navigate it just like your average human being who knows little to nothing about computers, right? So I think like to the extent that you're able to design to sort of like peel away one layer and say like, okay, super user, here's your playground. For everyone else, you stay here, you're going to be able to accomplish all the tasks you need to accomplish. And if you want to go deeper, you can. And I think also like any power user, if the tools are there, is going to figure out how to be a power user no matter what. So I think that there's, which is not at all to say that we should get lazy as designers, but I think that there are ways to sort of have your cake and eat it too, with regards to making sure that all the edge cases are accounted for, but however many clicks down it is, however much access you have to it is maybe decided by how many folks you actually think are going to go looking for it and how often that might need to happen. And one thing we've been trying to do a lot is like to start to leverage data to figure that out, right? So if we're designing for a particular edge case and we're like getting down to the nitty-gritty pixel situation, and we're like, let's pull back and see how many times this is actually happening in a month. It's 5, okay. You know, maybe we don't need to be so crazy about what color it is, right? Kind of like, I don't know if that's helpful as well, but I think that's like one way that I've seen it kind of navigated at Flatiron.
To Neha's previous point about like a newsletter or sending out sending super users to do coaching, things like that. We're repeating this, like clinicians are obviously extremely busy. Something we found previously with sending newsletters, it was more like a change log, like your typical tech change log, but in the product there was a page that you could see product updates. So you get an email, and in that email would be the product update explaining what changed. We found that, I mean, lives are so busy, it was really hard for clinicians to read it. And we found ourselves just continuously pointing back to like, oh, well, it was in that, you know, product update, isn't that, it becomes this like, I think it sounds really great, at least in the experience that I had, it sounded really great, but it ended up being a lot of noise. Like, what are ways, there's obviously like, it's a moving line of, this is important enough to make a product update, this is not important enough to make a product update, but still it feels like we end up sending out a bunch of noise rather than useful information. And it's not for, you know, either side's ill intention or anything. But you do have that tension of like the product team wants to continuously ship updates, you know, continuously improve the product without inundating you guys with changes. And I also think something that's interesting is like, there's this concept of experimentation that, you know, a lot of tech companies want to take, like A/B testing, or put this out for like 3 weeks, gather data, see if it did well or not. But that obviously also causes potentially whiplash with our users. There's not really a question embedded there, I guess, but more just like posing it to see what the group thinks or what your experience is.
Angela, I can tell you from my experience that yes, you're right that it can be a lot of noise. That's why we avoid doing any pop-ups or alerts within Epic itself to avoid that kind of alert fatigue. But it's also, I think it comes down to the frequency, and not just frequency, but reliability of getting that newsletter, predictability of getting that newsletter every X number of days, because that way it's not just when you have an update you send out a newsletter where that will be lost. It's more like, if they know, okay, every 2 weeks in my inbox there's this email that I ignore, but I know it's in there, then at least they can relay back to it. But to your point about how do we draw that line, or when do we communicate beyond writing, I think if you have a regular meeting with your super user scheduled, whether that's a super user or whether that's your product liaison within your customer, I think that's a good time to bring up, 1, upcoming product changes, and 2, discuss which ones you think they would, because they know their users, right? Which ones they think warrants a larger communication channel versus just a tip sheet or an update type thing. And I think I'm sorry, I missed your name, but to the point about Apple having the different layers of usability. Another point around that is, so within healthcare, you know, I've noticed that a lot of tech companies, and this is coming from the outside, but I've noticed that a lot of tech companies really, really like to focus on that individual user of like, this is for a physician, so let me talk to physicians, or this is for billing, so let me talk to billing. But actually, you're going to affect, I mean, your change or your product or your whatever, your functionality is going to affect a lot more than just the physician, even though they're your front-facing end users. Like, I'm sure Jill will agree that whenever you have Epic updates, you know, the clinician is the one signing off on it. The physician is the one signing off on the order set. But pharmacy and nursing do so much in the background, operationally speaking, that that physicians never know about because we just do it. And the physician may not be able to tell you, by the way, make sure you build it this way so that, the pharmacist can do this too, and nursing can do this as well. So when you're talking to your end users, or when you're talking to your super users, make sure you have all those tangential users available as well that are looking at the product, even if you don't think that it may affect them, because you don't know, and they may not know.
Neha, honestly, what you just kind of followed up with was what I was gonna chime in with. So I'm also at Flatiron with Elena, but before that I was at ZocDoc for 3 years. And I think kind of the biggest takeaway in all this work we were doing with practices is the importance of contextual inquiry in the lens of service design and not just interface design. Getting to see what was actually going on in an office, and how, to your point, like a provider or someone higher up in the staff hierarchy, would have all these opinions, and then actually sitting and watching what was going on at the front desk or at the workstations with the nurses, you get a sense of what's going on in the actual practice ecosystem. And, thinking about something as, this insurance eligibility process is taking us so long, and then you see what they're actually doing. And you can think of all these interface updates you want to make to it, but oftentimes, even if what they're doing is, very kind of like clunky and cumbersome, they're used to it. So that change management component of even making something that from like a UX standpoint seems much more succinct was just like kind of a big takeaway in terms of best practices of always considering like who are the different roles within the practice that are going to be impacted by this, even if what we're offering up on this platter is ideally much more simplistic. There's this whole kind of component of changing what's going on within the practice itself. So I just agree with you on that level.
On more of a tactical level, I don't know if there's like specific methodology people have found to be useful, like something that we have been, just came up today actually, that we're going to, I think, try out is actually do like a short video recording of our roadmap and the features that are going to be like released. Because of the tension that I mentioned earlier, we have like a lot of startup customers who like know almost nothing about medical billing, and they need to like actually learn and be taught. And so they're consuming a lot of this material like educationally. And then we have a lot of like power users who have been in systems like Epic for a really long time or Athena for a really long time. And then they're trying to understand our system in the ways that it's different. And so one method I think we're going to try out is doing like a video roadmap review or feature release. But we'll see. I have some skepticism that people will like actually spend time engaging with that content, because I don't ever watch that type of stuff. So I can't imagine other people taking their time to do it. But yeah, I think in the education sphere, there's like definitely a lot more work to even just bring people up to speed to what the features mean and why they're important. And then it's just like explaining, what's changed.
I like that you guys are all mentioning like, understanding the workflows and, having like a roadmap and stuff. But I also think that like one thing to keep in mind is I think it's important to learn the day-to-day lives of the people you're designing for. Because there might be things that like they're complaining about like a certain feature, right? Or they say like, oh, it's too hard to like do this and that. And you think those are the pain points, but I think that like there's other things. It's like what JJ was saying earlier, that like there's other things that like maybe they can't articulate what their other pain points are. So I think it's important to kind of see like from a designer's perspective, like what is their day-to-day and like what are some possible things in their day-to-day that's affecting the way they use the product.
Yeah, to Jill's point, as much as I possibly can, whenever I come into a new implementation, I try to do 3 different workflows, workflow shadowing. One is to follow a patient from end-to-end journey, just so I understand the whole organization and see where that patient interacts. I work on the inpatient teams, so it's very different from, you know, working in a clinic, but we're following that patient's end-to-end journey. 2, following, like she said, a nurse, a physician, and then obviously pharmacy tech from there on their one shift, as much as I possibly can. And then 3 is following a medication order from end to end. So because because that's my specialty, from the beginning of, okay, when this order is not even written, but when they think they might need this order, especially for something like for chemo, for example, where the order might be written a little bit later, but you know, the conversations get started much earlier, to all the way to the order, the production or compounding of the order of the medication, and especially looking at, you know, supply chain, and then dispensing and administration, and finally documentation of that medication order. There's so many points that touch that one workflow that you will never realize if you just ask either a pharmacist or a nurse or a physician.
Yeah, thank you for that, Neha. One thing on the contextual inquiry side, we talked about this a few sessions ago as well, as like, how do we incorporate other members of our team, not just the designers, to do the contextual inquiry? That way everyone building has this product set. So like for our engineering counterparts, how do we get them to shadow like once a month? You know, it's not like it's not their primary job function, but once a month, go listen in on like 2 hours of a like patient provider call or something like that. I would love to move us forward to a question that Neha had, since you're here, but you sent this message and not sure if, like Chuck, since you guys sent these like a month ago, yeah, it's hard to remember sometimes. But Neha asked, what are some design considerations for inpatient use? And are there any of these that are currently live that we can discuss? Is that right? Feel free to add any context. I feel like maybe the Flatiron team here might have the closest like experience, but inpatient use, if anyone has design experience and considerations there.
Just to clarify a question, when you say inpatient use, you're talking about like patient-facing tools?
Yeah, I mean, I was primarily looking for, yes, solutions that are inpatient facing or just very clinically facing, as opposed to what I've seen is more, I guess, operational or administrative or billing.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have, so 2 sides of the business at Flatiron. One side is the provider-facing side, the other side deals with data and academics, research. So Hallie and I are both on the healthcare side, which is the side that faces providers. I mean, I think the one interesting thing, and I think this was mentioned earlier, is that when you are designing a user interface, you are designing, especially when it comes to doctors, for a whole range of ages and comfort levels with technology. So we have some doctors who are, you know, older Gen Z, right, who are tech natives. And then we have the doctor who's like, I don't care where it is in the EHR, I'm gonna print it out. And I'm gonna have it on my desk with a billion other papers. So you better make the print function great too. So I think that for me has definitely been sort of an interesting challenge, along with the idea that there's extraordinarily high risk associated with doing small changes, right? So I want to move a button, and because it really doesn't belong where it is, but it's like, it's been there for 10 years. And if we move it, that's a patient safety risk issue all of a sudden, right? So I think that there are some sort of interesting quirks that come up with that would not lead you to purely say like this is design best practice, right? But because of the particular situation and the population that you design for, it has to be that way, which I think is kind of an interesting tension with like, sometimes the designer you want to be and the designer you have to be. But Hallie, I don't know if you have other thoughts there.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd add on, and again, speaking more so from my experience at ZocDoc, where I was designing kind of a mixture of provider facing and patient facing interfaces. I'm still like 3 months in at Flatiron, so it's a little bit newer landscape for me. But kind of echoing what Elena was saying with regards to different types of savviness across providers, you get the same thing across patients. So one of the things I was working on at ZocDoc was trying to develop like a digital intake system for practices and their patients. So it was a double-edged interface, and we had this kind of like ethos and design principle of creating something that enabled practices to work in a workflow that worked best for the populations that they served. So creating flexibility in the solution so that for patients that were more tech savvy and used to being able to complete things end to end on their mobile devices or on a desktop, practices were able to enable them to just kind of complete that on their own at home versus designing a system that would also allow for our patients that were a little bit of an older demographic, more so used to doing things over the phone as opposed to, having to do it totally on their own through a website, giving a design solution that allowed them to kind of streamline that phone call with someone at a practice and make that communication really easily accessible. So I guess my biggest takeaway, both from being at Flatiron so far and my time at ZocDoc, is just that there's no such thing as like a silver bullet solution for any of your patients or any of your providers. So always trying to kind of rest upon these design principles of, allowing for user freedom and control, but also enough guardrails that they're not just kind of lost out there. So the adaptability is really key in terms of just the way that we've thought through it. I wouldn't say necessarily that's the best practice either, but just something we try to kind of think about from a principle standpoint with everything we design.
Thank you.
All right, in the last couple of minutes, we have got into this habit, sort of like a food for thought question at the end of each of these sessions. This week's will be from Elena at Flatiron, which is, I will just read it verbatim for now, but let's talk about AI. Are we excited? Are we worried? What parts of our jobs will it make easier? What parts might make it harder? And what are the potentials specifically for healthcare design? And I will drop this into our chat.
Well, I think it's a great, timely question. And I just got back from the Figma Config conference, where they introduced a whole bunch of AI-driven tools. And so I've been thinking about that a lot recently in particular. I'd say it's terribly exciting from a pure design standpoint. But when, in a healthcare setting, some of these more data-driven tools, just got to be mindful of what we're putting in there. So there's got to be some level of governance of not putting, protected information into any of these tools. Say if we wanted to, build a new visualization for data or something like that, it'd be pretty bad to, feed that into a tool that's in any way public, and compromise our data at that point. But I think there's some great things some great possibilities out there on the design front, as far as using AI as a research tool, to say, all right, I'm building something that does this, bring me other examples. You're not gonna be able to look at every site, every tool out there. So it just can kind of help broaden your horizons with respect to being open to ways of displaying information or capturing information. So by and large, cautiously optimistic about it.
Jesse just shared a tool in the chat. From a design side, this is actually something I've been thinking about and chatting about too, like as these tools, as something like Figma gets like even more sophisticated, even easier to use, how much of our jobs end up being, as like designers, I guess, ends up being moving pixels around, creating boxes, all these things. And what are ways in which like we can leverage that, like you're saying, Elena, rather than being like nervous or scared for it. Like hopefully it, you know, gives us more time to think about service design, think about like the product impacts of some of these journeys rather than like the specific pixels. Something I'm really excited about from the clinical side is like all the opportunities to hopefully reduce the amount of documentation that providers are doing right now and how much just like fatigue that causes. It's like, how can our systems take advantage of like the context that they have to create as much of this documentation in obviously PHI safe, et cetera, ways. Like these all probably have to be like self-hosted solutions, not anything being sent to OpenAI or anything like that. But you know, being a large language model and documentation being so much, lots of text, hopefully it's like a really good opportunity to improve on some of those like care notes and summaries and action items.
One tool that's been under kind of some discussion where I am has been in the reporting side of things. You know, so to not have a, you know, I necessarily have one that's for, you know, custom reports for data and allow people to kind of self-serve them in a more natural way. Would take some load off of our teams and some of the less reusable work for really highly customized reports.
I mean, pixel pushing should die. I think 80% of it should die, and that will be a boon to actually doing real design work. I mean, pixel pushing is design work, but I will be pleased as punch when we're doing a lot less of that and getting to human problems that are screwy and how we're working with machines and other humans and policy versus worrying about, God, you know, how do I make another freaking box? That seems like a waste of our collective time. That's small d versus big D in design. The second thing is the cost of intelligence is going down. And that to me is radically amazing because with compression in the algorithms that we're, you know, coming out with in compression algorithms, you'll be able to house, you know, the world's knowledge on your Android phone. I mean, everything in a large language model on your wrist. So that becomes a huge piece of potential that's amazeballs. Is there some crazy things about, you know, what happens when it gets 1,000 times magnitudes of order bigger and more intelligent than us? That gets scary quickly. But there's some amazing things that can happen and equally amazing scary things. The problem is, as a species, we're really good at looking mostly at the amazing things and generating that.
Thank you, Johan. You always have the spicy takes, and I love ending on them. Super glad you were able to join the last couple of minutes here. We'll have to figure out a way to deconflict your recurring meeting. I have to boot those people out of this time slot. But yeah. Well, thank you guys all so much for joining. This was really fun. I'll send out a feedback form. Hopefully we can continue improving the session for everyone, but appreciate those who are new and appreciate those who have been coming back. It's always a good conversation. So look forward to seeing you guys next month. Take care. T2.